So you were saying you wanted to get to the bottom of what's causing so much anxiety in Gen Z.
Yeah, it's really concerning to see.
Well, to help us understand this better, we're diving into The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt.
Oh, that's a good one. I think you'll find this one pretty interesting. It's not just a research book.
Right, it's got social commentary and practical advice too. A good blend.
Absolutely. I think it gives a really insightful look at all the factors that are playing into these mental health issues for Gen Z. And it even offers some solutions, which is helpful.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me was this idea of the great rewiring of childhood that Haidt talks about. He even goes as far as to compare it to like raising kids on Mars.
It's a powerful metaphor, isn't it?
Yeah. What do you make of that comparison?
Well, I think what he's getting at is that this generation is growing up in an environment that's so different from what their brains evolved for, that it's almost like they've been sent to another planet.
Wow. That's a really interesting way to think about it.
They're adapting, of course, kids are resilient, but it makes you wonder, at what cost?
Right. So it's not just that the world has changed, it's that those changes are actually rewiring their brains, and maybe in ways that make them more vulnerable to anxiety.
That's the argument Haidt is making, and he highlights two major shifts that are really driving this rewiring.
Okay, I'm curious. Lay it on me.
The first one is this rapid rise of technology, particularly smartphones and social media.
Especially around 2012, right?
Exactly. Right around when smartphones and social media became really ubiquitous.
It's interesting, thinking about that timing, because it almost feels like the explosion of the selfie and Instagram, that whole culture, coincided with a really sharp increase in these anxiety rates. Especially we're seeing it among girls.
The correlation is definitely there.
Yeah.
And it's also important to remember that this is the generation that grew up with the front-facing camera.
Oh, totally. Like constantly documenting and curating their lives for this online audience.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to even imagine the kind of pressure that puts on a developing brain.
Yeah. And along with this technology revolution, Haidt also talks about this trend of overprotection that's been kind of building since the 80s. It seems like parents are just more fearful of letting their kids have independence in the real world.
Oh, absolutely. He mentioned some pretty startling statistics, actually.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, for example, he says the average age the parents felt comfortable letting their kids play unsupervised in their own front yard was 10 years old.
10 years old. I mean, I was roaming the neighborhood with my friends by then.
Right. It's pretty wild.
It feels like in just a few decades, we've gone from free-range kids to like bubble-wrapped kids.
That's a good way to put it. And Haidt argues that this overprotection, when it's combined with the constant presence of smartphones, creates what he calls experience blockers. And those are preventing kids from having the real-world experiences that are so crucial for developing resilience and social skills and just a sense of self-efficacy,
Right, so they're missing out on those essential developmental milestones that we all need to navigate the challenges of life.
Exactly. And that leads to what he calls the 4 foundational harms.
Okay, this is getting really interesting.
And these harms are kind of the specific ways that this rewiring is manifesting as anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues.
I'm ready to hear more about those.
Okay, well, so the first one might surprise you.
All right, hit me with it.
It's social deprivation.
Social deprivation. I would think with a generation that's constantly connected online, they'd be anything but socially deprived.
Right, you'd think so, but the research actually shows that teens today are reporting higher levels of loneliness than ever before.
Wow, that's so surprising. It seems counterintuitive, but I guess what you're saying is all that online interaction isn't a true substitute for real face-to-face connection.
Exactly. They're missing out on the nuances of nonverbal communication. The shared experiences, just the spontaneous interactions that you can only get in person, the stuff that really builds those genuine social bonds.
So they're hyper-connected, but still feeling isolated. Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, what about the second harm? What is it?
It's sleep deprivation. I mean, we all know teenagers need a solid 8 to 9 hours of sleep.
For sure.
But it's that allure of the smartphone, with its endless notifications and the blue light, it just makes it so hard for them to actually get the rest that they need.
I can only imagine how much worse it is now than when we were teens. And I'm assuming that sleep deprivation just leads to a cascade of other negative effects.
Totally. Not just on their mood and their energy levels, but also on their ability to learn and to focus and even regulate their emotions.
Right. It's a vicious cycle. They're tired, they reach for their phone for a quick dopamine hit, and that further disrupts their sleep. Makes sense. Okay, so we've got social deprivation and sleep deprivation. What's the third one?
The third harm is attention fragmentation.
I was just thinking about that. I mean, it seems like with all those notifications and the constant stream of information online, their brains are just being trained for distraction.
Exactly. It's got to make it so much harder to focus and to think deeply about things.
And that has implications not just for school, but for relationships and creative pursuits and even just relaxing.
Like they're always on, you know?
Right. Constantly bombarded. All right. So social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation. What's that fourth harm?
The fourth one is probably the most concerning: addiction.
Oh, yeah.
The way social media and online games are designed with their dopamine loops and reward systems is, well, it's incredibly addictive.
They're almost intentionally designed to exploit our brain chemistry, aren't they?
That's what Haidt argues. And you remember those Facebook files that were leaked a while back? They actually revealed internal discussions within Facebook about how to make their apps even more engaging, even if that meant making them more addictive.
It's unsettling, isn't it, that they're designed to keep us hooked, even at the expense of our mental health.
For sure.
So we have these four foundational harms: social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction. I mean, it sounds like a recipe for anxiety and just unhappiness in general.
It definitely is. And while these harms are affecting all of Gen Z, they're actually playing out in different ways for boys and girls.
That makes sense. I mean, they're having different experiences online, facing different social pressures. They even engage with technology differently.
Right.
So tell me more about how this great rewiring is impacting boys and girls differently.
Okay, let's start with girls. Social media, with its emphasis on appearance and social comparison, it's creating a particularly challenging environment for them.
I could see how that would be such a breeding ground for anxiety, especially with all those filters and curated images. They create these really unrealistic beauty standards.
It's not just beauty standards, though. You also have to think about how these social media platforms amplify the drama and the social pressures that are already part of being a teenager,
Yeah.
It's got to make it even harder to navigate all of that stuff in a healthy way.
Right. And Haidt brings up cyberbullying, which seems to be more prevalent among girls, too.
Yeah, he talks about Alexis Spence in the book.
Okay.
She's a young woman who struggled with eating disorders and self-harm. And a big part of that was because of the pressure she felt from being on Instagram.
That's so sad.
It is. But I think her experience is a good example of how the algorithms and just the whole culture of these platforms, they can have a devastating impact on someone's mental health.
It's a reminder that we aren't just talking about abstract concepts here. This is having a real impact on young people's lives.
Absolutely.
And the statistics kind of back that up, right?
You do.
I mean, girls' self-harm rates have just skyrocketed in recent years.
Yeah.
And it's happened right alongside the rise of social media.
It's hard to ignore that correlation, that's for sure. So you have girls grappling with all these pressures online.
Right.
And then at the same time, boys are facing a different set of challenges.
Interesting. In what way?
Haidt argues that boys are being hit hard by the decline in real-world risk-taking and just opportunities to have agency in the real world.
So while girls are kind of being overexposed to the online world, boys are being underexposed to the real world.
Exactly.
Huh.
They're spending less time engaging in unstructured play, exploring their environment, testing their limits. And when you don't get that real-world experience, it can make you feel less confident, less prepared to face challenges.
Makes sense. So where are they turning to fill that void?
Well, according to Haidt, a lot of boys are turning to video games and pornography.
Oh, wow.
It's a way for them to find that stimulation and that sense of accomplishment they're missing in their offline lives.
So it's like they're caught in this push and pull.
Yeah.
They're held back from real-world experiences, but drawn deeper into these virtual worlds that, well, they don't always promote healthy development.
It's a good way to put it. And this withdrawal from real-life challenges, it can have serious consequences. Think about that hikikomori phenomenon in Japan, where young men become so overwhelmed by the pressures of society that they just isolate themselves completely.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
It's an extreme example, but it shows you the potential dangers of this trend.
It's almost like we're raising two separate generations, each on its own planet, right?
Yeah.
Boys on one, girls on the other. And they're each facing unique challenges as a result of this great rewiring. But Haidt doesn't just focus on the psychological and social impacts of all this, does he?
You're right, he doesn't.
I mean, he also talks about a deeper, more spiritual impact.
He does. He talks about the idea of spiritual degradation. And he argues that this constant immersion in the digital world is preventing us from connecting with something larger than ourselves.
I find that idea so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's like we're so consumed with all the little details of our daily lives, the constant notifications, curating our online personas, that we've kind of lost touch with a sense of meaning and purpose.
Yeah, you said it. Haidt points out that this idea of self-transcendence, the ability to connect with something beyond our own ego, it's actually a core element of a lot of ancient wisdom traditions.
Oh, really?
Yeah, from Buddhism to Taoism, they see that relentless focus on the self as an obstacle to enlightenment.
So our phones are almost feeding our egos.
You could say that.
Yeah.
Keeping us trapped in a cycle of self-absorption, making it harder to experience that deeper sense of connection.
Wow. So what's the antidote?
Well, one way to counteract this spiritual degradation, according to Haidt, is to make sure we're having experiences of awe and wonder,
Right.
especially in nature.
I like that.
He actually assigns his students awe walks where they walk in nature without their phones.
No phones.
Nope. And he says they report these profound shifts in their perspective and their well-being just from doing that.
That makes sense. It makes me think about those moments in my own life where I've felt a sense of awe or like disconnectedness to something bigger than myself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's often been in nature, but also just in those moments of shared human experience, like a concert or something.
Yeah.
But those experiences, they do feel like they're becoming more and more rare with technology kind of dominating everything.
That's a good point. But the good news is, Haidt is optimistic. He really believes that we can reverse this trend, that we can rewire childhood in a more positive way.
Well, that's good to hear.
But he also acknowledges that it's a collective action problem. It's going to take effort from all of us. Governments, tech companies, schools, parents, we all have to work together.
I'm really eager to hear more about those solutions. What are the specific steps we can take to create a healthier environment for these kids, to help them navigate this digital world without having to sacrifice their mental and spiritual well-being?
Let's start with governments and tech companies. They have a huge responsibility to create a safer online world for children. Haidt is a big advocate for these duty of care laws,
Okay.
similar to the UK's age-appropriate design code.
Which, if I remember correctly, that code basically sets design standards to make these platforms safer for kids. It's like guardrails for the internet, right?
Exactly. So think stricter age verification, limiting addictive algorithms, and giving parents more control over what their kids are seeing and doing online.
It all seems like common sense, but it requires a huge shift in mindset for these companies.
It does.
I mean, they've been operating for so long under this assumption that more engagement is always better, even if it's hurting the users.
And Haidt argues that we need to start holding them accountable for the impact their products are having, especially on young people. He also suggests raising the age of internet adulthood to 16.
I like that idea.
Right.
Right now, they can sign contracts at 13, and they don't really even understand what they're agreeing to.
It's like letting them drive a car before they've learned the rules of the road.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
So, raising the age to 16, along with better age verification, would give them more time to develop those critical thinking skills and the emotional maturity to actually handle being online.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got government setting guardrails, tech companies playing by the rules. What about schools? What can they do?
Well, Haidt is a big proponent of phone-free schools. He believes that schools should be these havens from all the distractions of the digital world.
Yeah.
You know, places where kids can focus on learning and socializing and being creative without that constant pull of the phone.
I mean, let's be real. It's hard to focus on anything when your phone's buzzing with the latest TikTok drama.
Right.
Or have a real conversation with a friend when you're both half scrolling through Instagram.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is, some schools have already done this.
They've gone phone free.
Yeah, and they've seen incredible results. Less cyberbullying, more face-to-face interaction, students are more engaged, grades have even gone up in some cases.
Wow. Sounds like a win-win.
It really does. And then finally, we have the parents. Haidt believes that parents are key to reversing this whole overprotection trend we've been talking about.
It's understandable why parents are so much more protective than they used to be, though, right? I mean, the world does seem scarier. The news is full of all these scary stories, and then you have all the dangers online.
For sure.
But is all this caution backfiring?
That's the question. Haidt argues that kids are what he calls anti-fragile. They actually need to face challenges and risks in order to thrive.
Okay.
He uses this tree analogy. You know how the trees that were planted in Biosphere 2, they grew tall and slender but kept falling over?
Yeah.
Because there was no wind to strengthen their trunks.
Oh, interesting. So by trying to protect our kids from every little danger, we might be making them more vulnerable in the long run.
That's what he's saying. They need those bumps and bruises. They need to learn how to navigate social conflicts. They need to learn to assess risks for themselves.
So how do we strike that balance? How do we encourage independence and resilience without putting them in unnecessary danger?
Well, Haidt really emphasizes delaying smartphones as long as possible. He thinks high school should be the new norm,
Wow.
not middle school. And even then, set clear boundaries around screen time.
Right.
And the big one, model healthy tech habits ourselves.
Lead by example.
Yep. I know it's tough. There's so much pressure from kids, from their peers, to be plugged in all the time.
Oh, absolutely.
But that's why this collective action piece is so important. If enough parents push back against this early tech immersion, if we create a culture where real-world experiences are actually valued, we can shift the tide.
It's about creating a new normal.
Mm.
But even if we delay smartphones and encourage more real-world play, I mean, we're still kind of fighting an uphill battle, aren't we?
Yeah.
This digital world is so enticing, so all-consuming. How do we make the real world more appealing, more engaging for these kids?
That's where play comes in.
Play, right? He calls it the work of childhood. But I feel like kids have less and less time for unstructured play these days, with all the academic pressure and the schedules, activities, and everything.
And that's a huge problem. Play is how children learn to socialize, how they learn to negotiate, to solve problems, even how they learn to regulate their emotions.
It's how they develop creativity, resilience, that sense of agency we were just talking about.
Exactly. So we have to bring play back into the equation somehow.
So how do we do that?
Yeah.
How do we create more opportunities for kids to just be kids?
Well, for schools, it could look like longer recesses with less adult intervention.
Okay.
Maybe create designated play areas, have after-school play clubs, even incorporate more play-based learning into the curriculum.
It's about giving them the space and the freedom to explore and experiment and just discover what lights them up.
Right. And for parents,
Yeah.
prioritize unstructured playtime. Turn off the screens, step back from those scheduled activities, and just let them be bored.
I love that. Boredom is the birthplace of creativity.
It is. Encourage outdoor exploration, let them build forts, create obstacle courses.
Play board games, tell stories. It's all about making the real world more exciting than that virtual world.
Exactly. And it's not just about the kids either.
What do you mean?
It's about us rediscovering the joy of play ourselves, you know?
Yeah.
When we can model that sense of fun and adventure, when we show them that the real world is full of wonder and possibility, that's a powerful antidote to all the anxiety of the digital age.
It's so true. We have to rediscover that childlike sense of wonder for ourselves and for our kids. And as we've been talking about these solutions, it's really striking to me how much of it comes down to just shifting our perspective, rethinking our assumptions about what childhood should be like, how much technology is okay, what a good life even means.
It's like we've just gotten so used to this anxious, tech-saturated life, it's hard to even picture anything else.
Yeah.
Like Haidt says, we've created this big social experiment, but we're so caught up in it, we haven't stopped to ask if it's actually working.
And it's not just us as individuals, right? It's the values and priorities of our whole society. Are we choosing speed over depth? Are we choosing consumption over connection? Virtual experiences over real ones?
Those are the exact questions Haidt wants us to think about.
Yeah.
And like you said earlier, it's not about despair. It's about taking responsibility. We can change things.
We can create different environments for
Yeah,
ourselves.
absolutely. And he ends the book with this really thought-provoking question.
Oh yeah, what is it?
He asks, if we think of this great rewiring as a big social experiment, how do we design the next phase so it actually promotes human flourishing?
It's a great question. It makes you want to step back and really imagine a world where technology serves us, not the other way around.
Exactly.
A world where childhood is valued, not just as training for adulthood, but for what it is, and where we all prioritize things like connection, creativity, and well-being.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into the anxious generation, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there's hope. Gen Z's anxiety, it's not inevitable. It's a result of choices we've made, the environments we've built. And we can make different choices. We can build different environments.
We can reclaim childhood,
Yeah.
let kids guide their own development,
Yeah.
and maybe even rediscover some of that wonder ourselves in the process.
I like that.
Yeah.
Well said. And before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one last thing to think about. If you could design that next phase of childhood, what would it look like? What would be most important to you? What experiences would you want every child to have?
It's a great question to consider. And who knows, maybe your answer will spark a movement, start a change, create a ripple effect that helps create a healthier, happier world for future generations. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the anxious generation. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and keep seeking out those moments that remind us what it means to be human.